Hello and welcome to this video-based study of the book of Daniel. For those watching who don't know me, my name is Mike Monroe and I am an elder and the minister of adult education at the Pleasant Ridge Church of Christ in Arlington, Texas. This study will consist of 13 lessons. Some of the material will be familiar to you from as far back as your childhood Sunday school classes, but some of it will be rather deep and intense, and it'll require a lot of concentration and patience to understand. My prayer is I'll be able to present these lessons in a way that will communicate the message of this marvelous book in a clear, if maybe not always concise manner. Our plan for this study will be to look at the book one chapter at a time in each lesson. Well, that is until we come to chapter 11. Now that chapter is much more complicated than the others, and it will require 3 lessons to deal with it properly. Other than that, each lesson will cover an entire chapter of the book. In this first lesson, after a general introduction to the book, we will learn about the first deportation of Jewish exiles to Babylon as experienced in the lives of Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known by their Babylonian names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I thank you for joining me on this adventure in the study of the Word of God. The authorship of the book of Daniel is a complicated subject. Parts of it were clearly written by Daniel himself during the 6th century BC. But there is evidence of editorial work in the final composition of the book. And some scholars suggest that this editor might have been none other than the great scribe Ezra. We don't know for certain when the book was completed in its final form. The events chronicled in the historical narrative of the book, that is, not counting the events foreseen in the prophetic section towards the end, these events took place between 606 and 538 BC. And if the final editor of the book was indeed Ezra the scribe, the book probably achieved its present form somewhere between 450 and 425 BC. We are equally uncertain as to where the book was composed. But if we follow the assumption that it was collected and edited by Ezra for the benefit of the post-exilic Jewish community that had returned to their homeland, then Jerusalem would be a safe guess for the place of its composition. The book of Daniel could be described as a theological analysis of the history of the Jewish people after the loss of their monarchy and their independence. In 586 BC, more than 800 years after the Israelite conquest of Canaan, and more than 450 years after the establishment of the kingdom of Israel, the Babylonian armies of the great king Nebuchadnezzar overran the land of Israel, smashed down the walls of Jerusalem, burned the temple of God to the ground, and carried the population away in chains to captivity. After an exile of 70 years and a change in the world political order, the Jewish people were given permission to return to their homeland and start over. But things would never be the same again. While their cities might be rebuilt and their sacrifices resumed in a new temple, the dynastic monarchy of the mighty King David would never be restored. Instead, the Jewish nation would exist as a vassal state, subject to the rule of a series of powerful empires that would rise and fall one after the other for more than 600 years. And the purpose of the book of Daniel was to assure a despondent and disillusioned people that although their world seemed to have fallen to pieces around them, their God was still firmly in control, directing the course of human history to achieve his own divine ends. The literary genre of the book is a combination of historical narrative in chapters 1 through 6 and apocalyptic vision in chapters 7 through 12. The central character is Daniel, and in many points his life story is remarkably similar to that of Joseph. He was taken against his will from his homeland while he was still a youth. He gained the attention of the ruler of his captivity through the interpretation of dreams, and he rose to the top echelons of power in the land of his exile. Daniel's life and career spanned the entire 70-year duration of the Babylonian exile. His remarkably detailed visions portray the course of future events from the exile to the time of Christ so accurately that most liberal scholars who do not accept the possibility of supernatural prophecy will not admit to a date of composition any earlier than the 2nd century BC. Now, as we mentioned before, the book contains certain idiosyncrasies which seem to indicate that it's the product of an inspired editorial process rather than a monograph composed by a single author. Chapter 1:1 through chapter 2 and verse 3 are written in the third person in the Hebrew language. Now, this section appears to be the inspired editor's personal preface to the book. Chapter 2 verse 4 through chapter 7 verse 28 are written in the third person in the Aramaic language. Aramaic was the lingua franca, the common language of the ancient Middle East, and the official language of the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian empires. By the end of the exile, the Jews had all but forgotten their ancestral Hebrew language, and Aramaic continued to be their native tongue through the end of the apostolic age. This Aramaic section of the book was perhaps taken from official Babylonian and Persian records and incorporated without translation into the text of the book by the inspired editor. Chapter 8 verse 1 through chapter 12 verse 13 are written in the first person, with a few exceptions, in the Hebrew language. And this section seems to have been taken directly from the personal memoirs of Daniel, written in his native tongue. Now, interestingly enough, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was produced some 100 years before Christ, 3 additions to the book of Daniel appear, which are not present in any of the original Hebrew Aramaic manuscripts. First is the Song of the Three Hebrew Children. This little story consists of 68 verses inserted between verses 23 and 24 of chapter 3, which is the account of the fiery furnace. The 3 Hebrew children of the title are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the story embellishes the inspired account of the incident of the fiery furnace. The second extra book is Susanna. In the Greek Old Testament, this story comprises a separate chapter of 64 verses inserted at the very beginning of the book. In the Latin translation, upon which the English Catholic Bible is based, is placed at the end of the book and counted as chapter 13. Now, in the story, Daniel defends the virtue of a young Jewish girl named Susanna, who has been falsely accused of adultery by 2 lecherous Jewish elders. The third story, Bel and the Dragon, consists of 42 verses and actually contains 2 separate but related stories. These verses are tacked on to the end of the inspired book as chapter 13 in the Greek translation and chapter 14 in the Latin. In the first story, the story of Bel, Daniel ridicules the worship of idols, and he exposes to King Cyrus of Persia the fraudulent tactics of the priests of Bel, who make it appear that their god consumes food sacrifices that have been sealed up in his temple overnight. As a result, the priests are put to death and the temple of Bel is destroyed. The dragon is a sequel to the story of Bel. Sometime after the destruction of the temple of Bel, the people worship the dragon, which is presumably some kind of snake or lizard. And the king says that unlike Bel, the dragon is a clear example of a living god. Daniel promises to destroy the dragon without a sword, which he does by baking cakes according to a certain recipe, which caused the dragon to burst open upon eating them. Now, these stories are all clearly apocryphal, being composed sometime during the 2nd century BC, some 400 years after Daniel's time, and they'll be of no concern to us in this study. The historical narrative of the book begins with the deportation of four Jewish youths, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who are better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are deported to Babylon during the third year of King Jehoiakim of Judah. The year is about 606 BC. This was the first of three deportations of Jewish people to Babylon, and it marked the official beginning of the 70-year exile, although the final destruction of Jerusalem and the temple would not occur for another 20 years. Much of the historical narrative is concerned with Daniel's relationship with Nebuchadnezzar, the powerful king of Babylon and the conqueror of Judah. As we have already noted, Daniel's admirable personal qualities, his astute leadership and statesmanship, and especially his divine gift for interpreting the king's troubling dreams, soon led him to his elevation to the highest levels of power and influence in the Babylonian government. This would also be true of Daniel's relationship with the Persian authorities towards the end of his life. Well, in all of that, what is the benefit for modern readers like us of studying the book of Daniel in the first place? Well, first I would say that the lives of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are excellent examples of how the people of God should live in a godless and hostile society. Second, the book is faith-building. It bears witness to God's sovereignty over the ebb and flow of human history and assures the faithful that even when the world seems to be in chaos, God is in control of the affairs of men, and He is directing events toward the ultimate fulfillment of His purposes in creation. The book of Daniel provides an excellent introduction to the apocalyptic genre of literature. And by comparing the visions that are received and interpreted by Daniel during the period of the exile with their fulfillment in the years immediately following the exile until the time of Christ, we gain a working knowledge of the use of cryptic symbols and imagery in apocalyptic literature. And this is a valuable primer for interpreting the imagery of the New Testament book of Revelation. And so let's begin our study of the book of Daniel. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. The Babylonian exile officially began in the third year of King Jehoiakim of Judah. The year was 606 BC by our calendar. That was the same year in which Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne of Babylon. At the time of this first deportation of Jewish citizens to Babylon, the temple was looted but not destroyed. The gold and silver cups used by Belshazzar in his drunken banquet on the night the empire fell, as we will read about in chapter 5, were probably taken at this time. A second deportation and a more thorough looting of the temple came in 597, in the aftermath of King Jehoiakim's futile rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar. According to 2 Kings 24 and verse 13, the remaining treasures in both the temple and the royal palace were plundered at this time. The Ark of the Covenant, containing the ancient stone tablets on which God had engraved the Ten Commandments, was probably taken during this invasion. Now, a popular legend holds that the ark was smuggled out of Jerusalem by the prophet Jeremiah and hidden in a cave just before the city capitulated. However, the tight siege conditions that marked this invasion would have made such an event highly unlikely, if not impossible. And so modern day searches for the lost ark are probably simply a matter of chasing the wind. The temple itself survived until the final invasion of 586 BC, which involved the total destruction of the entire city of Jerusalem and the exile of almost all the rest of the people remaining in the land. The first group of exiles consisted primarily of Jewish young men of noble and or royal stock. Their total number is unknown, but they certainly must have represented the cream of Jewish young manhood, because the final years of the government in Jerusalem were characterized by an appalling lack of responsible and qualified male leadership. Upon arriving in Babylon, these young exiles were in effect sent to an Ivy League university. The accommodations were plush, the academic standards were high. The curriculum was rigorous, but those with the right stuff would be primed for service in the highest levels of royal government. The headmaster of this training academy was named Ashpenaz, the chief of King Nebuchadnezzar's officials, as the text tells us. A more literal translation of Ashpenaz's title is chief of eunuchs, and it's highly possible that all the Jewish youths placed in this program were also made eunuchs. And that would help to explain why Daniel apparently never married or had a family throughout his long residence in Babylon. Well, let's continue reading. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them, and to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abed-Nego. The only individuals mentioned by name from among this first group of deportees are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And they must have been terribly young at the time, perhaps as young as 12 to 15 years old, because at least one of them, Daniel, lived through the entire 70-year duration of the exile. Well, upon enrollment in the training program, they were each given a new Babylonian name. The assignment of a name to another person was a sign of authority or dominion over him, and was a common practice between victor and vanquished in ancient times. We have other examples of this in the historical books of the Old Testament. King Jehoiakim was so named by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. His original name had been Eliakim, which we read in 2 Kings 23 and verse 24. King Zedekiah received his name from Nebuchadnezzar himself. His parents had named him Mattaniah, 2 Kings 24:27. The new names given to Daniel and his friends are of obscure translation, but they appear to reveal Nebuchadnezzar's motives for their re-education. Daniel means Yahweh is my judge, whereas his assigned Babylonian name, Belteshazzar, incorporates the name of Bel, the chief deity in the Babylonian pantheon, and may be translated, may Bel protect his life. Well, as we shall see, Daniel's life was certainly protected, but it wasn't by Bel. Hananiah means Yahweh is gracious. Shadrach incorporates the name of Aku, the ancient Sumerian god of the moon, and appears to mean under the command of Aku. Mishael is probably to be translated, who is what God is. Meshach also incorporates the name of Aku and may be translated, who is what Aku is. Azariah means Yahweh has helped. Abed-Nego incorporated the name of Abu, the Babylonian god of wisdom, and the name probably means servant of Abu. All right, having learned the significance of these new names, let's continue our reading at verse 8. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. Then at the end of the days, which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. The remarkable ability of these young men to excel within Babylonian culture without being absorbed into it is the focal point of the first part of the book. Their Babylonian names were used in official contexts, but they still identified with their Hebrew names and with their Hebrew values. The matter of the academy cuisine was a case in point. The dietary restrictions of the law of Moses were counter to the culture to which the youths were supposed to be adapting. But over the long run, by remaining true to their faith, they were able to openly demonstrate the superiority of God's wisdom over the wisdom of men. The end of the chapter shows how God blessed and provided for these faithful young men. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Verse 17 seems to be misplaced in the text, breaking up the narrative about the young men's diet. It reads more smoothly if it's placed alongside verses 20 and 21, as I have done here. But together they demonstrate the providential activity of God within and through the lives of these faithful young men. As they were faithful to God, so also was God faithful to them. And then in something of a postscript, we are told that Daniel continued to serve until the first year of Cyrus the king. In other words, Daniel lived through the entire span of the Babylonian exile because Cyrus was the king of Persia, who overthrew Babylon and issued the edict permitting the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. As for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're not told how long they lived. We do know that at the request of Daniel, they were appointed to important administrative posts in the province of Babylon, as seen in chapter 2 and verse 49. And we'll see them again in chapter 3 in the incident of the fiery furnace, after which it is said that the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. Daniel 3 and verse 30. But beyond that, we know nothing about the lives of these three men. Nevertheless, they continue to live as examples of unshakable faith in the face of tremendous pressure to conform to the unholy standards of a prevailing culture. And so the story of Daniel begins. It's the story of a young man who was forcefully removed from everything he held dear, from his nation, from his family, and sometimes even from the freedom to worship his God according to the dictates of his conscience and the precepts of the covenant. Yet, with a faith that belied his youth, he held on to his integrity while still advancing and prospering in a hostile environment. It's the story with so many valuable lessons for Christians today as we strive to maintain our faithfulness to God and our Lord Jesus Christ in the midst of an increasingly hostile culture in society. In our next lesson, we'll learn how Daniel came to the attention and favor of the great king Nebuchadnezzar. You will reign forever.